Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be covering this book, The Woodcutter. I didn't go back and watch it, but I'm fairly certain that I covered a bit of this book in the 2023 year in review. I'll go over some of the details about how I purchased it, all the specific information about author, who the cover artist was, all that sort of thing, and then I'll get into my thoughts on the book. Now, I paid $5.98 for this. I bought it at Coaz sometime in 2022. This is copyright 2010, but this is the first 47 North edition 2012. I'm not seeing anything in the information about the cover design or the artists, so I'll just skip that part. The Woodcutter is an interesting retelling of a lot of classic European myths and folklore. So, the big thing is that it focuses on a very fairy tale setting. There are 12 kingdoms of man, and they all surround at different angles this large fairy wood. And the forest that the fairies reside in has a defender, the Woodcutter. And that is the character that this book follows. It's a lot of really short chapters. There are only about 270 pages, but there's well over, there's only 270 pages, but there's almost 80 chapters in it. So each chapter is pretty short. I think that comes out to about 3.5 pages per chapter. Some of them are only 1 or 2 pages long. Some of them are much longer by comparison. But the Woodcutter is basically an immortal creature that defends the fairies and any other magical creatures, and for the most part keeps the peace among these 12 kingdoms. Per their history, the fairies have the power to just completely wipe out humanity in this area, but they allow humans to live upon their land, provided the humans are respectful enough of fey creatures that they don't upset any balance, they don't upset any equilibrium. And in these 12 kingdoms, there are traditionally 6 kingdoms ruled by evil witches or evil princesses, and then 6 that are ruled by good advisors, good queens, princesses, good kings, that sort of thing. But what's happening is that there's some bizarre turmoil. Characters are showing up where they shouldn't be. A lot of fairy tale creatures and characters, including like Jack and the Beanstalk or Hansel and Gretel, and they're not necessarily in the same roles that they should in a more traditional fairy tale. For example, one of the kids that gets lost in the woods ends up being a princess that shouldn't have been in that story, or Snow White ends up in her situation, but it upsets the peace. And one region has like magical snow that is changing everything and making it very chaotic. There's an evil witch going around, one of Odin's hellhounds that is on the loose that the Woodcutter is supposed to hunt down and bring back into the fairy situation, I guess. And so there's someone moving and shaking and stirring up trouble, and the Woodcutter is the person who is tasked with fixing all of these different problems. I will say there is one aspect that I really don't like, and that is that the Woodcutter is supposed to be this neutral party kind of thing, or not necessarily neutral, but generally good-natured neutral. And he interacts with a lot of fairy tales that really don't make sense for him to do so. At the start of the book, he sets out and he has one axe that is his father's axe and he needs to protect, but he interacts with the that one fairy. I want to say it's a fable, one of Aesop's fables, or one of the old stories about the guy tosses in an axe into the water and is offered, is this one your axe? Is that one your axe? No, no, my axe is this one. He gets it back and then gets the other axes as a gift. In this case, it's not to provide wealth, but to provide additional weapons. That each weapon is a fey weapon, and only some, in this case the woodcutter, some creatures are able to withstand cold steel. In this case, and by the way, cold steel, for those that do not know, cold steel is just worked steel. So, or cold iron, I guess is the better way to put it. Cold iron is iron that has been smelted and forged. Now, fey creatures in theory can just interact with iron ore, but once it's smelted and then forged into something, they're weak to it. And the woodcutter is one of the very few fairies that uses metal. And how he does that, he's basically going around. The woodcutter is effectively like the woodsman in the Snow White story. And so he interacts with Snow White, he interacts with the Princess and the Pea, he interacts with Hansel and Gretel, with Jack and the Beanstalk. He interacts with a lot of characters that are recognizable from those older fairy tales, but they don't play the same role. And that's partially because the evil witch is doing something in a very modern fantasy way. I mean modern fantasy as in contemporary fantasy. It has very modern and contemporary elements in the story writing. The queen is going around trying to set up various princes or princesses in a way that makes them evil. She's using fairy magic, effectively enslaving a bunch of fairies to then turn them into, like, using fairy dust as an addictive drug or as something that can be used to control other people, or in some cases using this magic essence to make a normal girl into one of these fairy princesses. And what makes the 12 archetypal kingdoms unique is that each of them has fey blood in their ancestry, and it makes them all somewhat magical, but it also makes them weak to certain things. It makes them more powerful in certain ways, and to properly rule one of these kingdoms, you need that fairy blood. I believe they effectively all bleed blue, and so it's literally blue bloods that are ruling the kingdoms. That's partially one of the things I don't like about this, in that it separates itself from those fairy tales while constantly using them and, like, hint hint, nudge nudge, wink wink, like it's pushing you in that direction of, oh well, you know how this is going to end, how do they get there, haha. It's one of those weird elements that I'm not the biggest fan of. I didn't rate this very highly, and I don't think I'm ever going to reread it. I don't know, maybe if I were a young adult when I had read this, that I would have preferred it, but right now I'm not in a place where I do care for it. It does come off as one of those young adult books, but I don't see any advertising for it that indicates that, so overall it's readable. I say this all the time. These books with short chapters have very bite-sized portions to them. They're written in a way so that you can pick it up, read a page or two, put it back down, read another page or two, put it back down. Instead of these books with longer chapters where, these books with longer chapters, I'm thinking, I need to read one chapter all at once or else I'm going to lose my train of thought. The Woodcutter, pun intended, but it cuts up the chapters into very neat portions. And that is very good. And that's one of the few good things I'll give this book. But the way it interacts with a lot of these stories, it's trying to dabble in those old fairy tales while also trying to put a modern spin on things, and I'd rather just see allusions to those fairy tales rather than making them almost as faithful as they can be while sticking to this story. It just feels weird. It's like you're doing 2/3 the work that you actually need to, because the readers already know all of these stories and all of these characters, so you don't have to put in the legwork. You know that Snow White has this evil queen. You know that the Princess and the Pea has this encounter, and you can roughly expect how things are going to go. You know Jack and the Beanstalk has these plot elements that you're going to have to hit. You know Hansel and Gretel have these plot elements you know they're going to have to hit. So anything that deals with the captured fairies, anything that deals with the woodcutter is for the most part new, but a lot of these stories, the plot elements, have stories that you are basically expected to already know, and it feels slightly lazier for it. I'm not going to ruin anything more about the book, but I did find it kind of weird overall. Odin is referenced, and Odin and his hounds, but then none of the other Norse pantheon are mentioned. Odin is referenced more in regards to the Odin's hounds idea within fairy tales rather than Odin as a god, and that kind of carries through. There's like Titania and Oberon here, but they're not fully the classical ideas of them. So a lot of name drops, but quasi-faithful renditions of those characters into a much more modern and more contemporary plot that I wasn't the biggest fan of, but maybe there's someone out there who is a fan of it. I will say that the cover design, and I'll show it to you once again, this cover design is really good. It's why I picked it up. I really love greens and darker blues and earthy tones and maybe like night sky tones. I'm not a big fan of, it's ironic that I'm saying this while wearing a very bright yellow shirt, but warmer colors are not my cup of tea. And so this cover popped out to me because it's a very green, very dark cover. It's got a really decent size. Like I said, only 271 pages of content. So it's not too big. It's got a kind of almost old person font size. It's got an interesting premise, but execution wasn't the greatest. So yeah. Anyway, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.